I want you to look at more than one way to dye fabric. I think a lot of people think about dyeing as low water immersion dyeing. We are using, for dye painting, we're also using the same dye, and it adds a lot of versatility. For your low water immersion dyeing, these are just 3 blue samples. I liked how they look together. If you want the color to flow, you wet the fabric with water first. And that is how I mostly do my low water immersion dyeing, because it allows the dyes to separate out into the folds. But if you want less color flow, first you would wet the fabric with soda water. You know, a lot of people do that with tie-dye t-shirts. They wet it in soda water and they squirt on the colors, and they don't blend as much. They don't bleed together because the soda has fixed. As soon as the dye and soda meet, they're fixing. I did a lot of sampling for the DVD, and I found out a lot of stuff while I was getting ready for this. I knew that some of the yellows flowed differently than others. All of these are a red and yellow mixed. This is mixed with one blue, this is mixed with another blue, this is mixed with another blue. So this HE, and it's mixtures of an orange mixed with a blue. And you see the halos that come out, the way the dye flows. This is the nature of each of these separate single chemicals. Some of them react more quickly, some of them flow faster, some of them don't create a halo. A big point I'd like to make is how you manipulate the fabric will determine how it looks. There's 10 fat quarters here, and I mixed enough dye of one color to dye all of these 10 pieces. So I had an identical color mix, and I poured it on each of these. The first one is, yes, you can get fairly solid dyes. You mix it a lot. When I've wrinkled up the fabric dry before I put the water on it, and this one is when I've wrinkled it up while it's wet and I've gotten just finer little crunchy wrinkles, and so on. All of these are different ways the dye was manipulated and folded, and they were all identically treated in the sense that I wet them, I added the dye, I added the soda, I waited an hour, and I washed them. And the only difference is all this bright yellowish green color, that's because that particular yellow was able to flow into the folds. And these are the containers I put them in. I like white containers. I could see the color better. You put it in a black container, a blue container, green container, it reflects, and it's difficult to see. This is a 2-yard piece of fabric that was done in a flat plastic box. You can see if you have a box, you can pour different colors at different ends, but every single thing I did to this, where I moved my hands, changed where the dyes flowed. Here's a quilt I made back in the day. This is historic. But I thought it was so much fun to be able to dye these big pieces in small containers. Now, when you're dye painting and printing, it's the same dye concentrate, but when you mix it with thickener, you can control the flow of the dye. If you want more color flow, you wet the fabric in soda and you paint with thin dye. If you want less color flow, you want the dye to stick where you put it, like these black X's over here. Then you wet it in soda and you get the whole piece of fabric dry. You can even iron it if you want it to be really flat. And then you can paint it with thickened dye mixtures. This is my table. I was getting ready to do one of my large pieces from my contact series. Actually, for this quilt, I only used navy, blue, and orange. All of these are created with those 2 colors. And print paste to make it lighter colors. So the next slide I'll show you here. There's my recipe here for this black. And these grays are created by adding more print paste. This black is 2 tablespoons of navy, 3 tablespoons and 2 teaspoons of orange, and 1/4 cup of print paste. And all these other colors were created. So this is orange with a little bit of navy in it. And this is orange with a little bit more navy in it. And the point I really want to emphasize here is that you see where I've leveled it, this side is not washed. I've done the same thing. I ripped off a side and I left it on my table. And this piece here was washed in fact, it's hard to wash a little tiny piece of fabric very well. So I scrub it a little in both my hands in the sink and I poured boiling water over it to make sure. I don't want any excess dye left in there. The excess dye can run if it were to accidentally get wet, and it can fade to life. So anyway, this is where I'm addressing, if you don't see this kind of close matching in your results, then you need to check your process. And by the way, these are both dry. If they were wet, you wouldn't be able to tell what. So I'm doing this before I start so I know what I'll have. And I'm working on painting on the cotton. It took me quite a while to paint on this, and I would cover it with plastic and come back and paint. It's very confusing when some of the dye is dry and it looks like the color it's going to be, and I'm painting wet right next to it, and it's much darker than it will be. But all of these things can be surmounted. Okay, this is an early quilt I did when I'm sitting in a bedroom. It's about 10 by 11 foot bedroom with my table and my sewing machine and a window I could look out. And the whole quilt was painted with these three primary colors and print paste. Here's a detail of it. I mean, if you're into it, you can mix the colors and you can use a fine brush. I was painting on silk because this fine detail is hard to do on a coarse fabric. So the finer this weave, the easier it is to be nice and smooth. But you want textures, you want something a little different than anybody else has on their fabric shelf. Here's 4 examples of dye painted fabric with rollers and brushes and stamps and grids and monoprints. And now, this is where I would like you to really realize what you really need to want to be able to do is combine dye painting and low water immersion dyeing. And that these 3 examples are combination. These dark marks, I laid down strips of paper, newspaper, ripped newspaper, laid it over the fabric that had been already dyed, and put on this color with a roller. Okay, just to give you an idea. And the dots, of course, had to be a thickened dye too. Sometimes I spray the dye, but that has to go outside. Anyway, lots of layers possible. Lots of textures. You have fine little tiny little textures you can cut up, and you may find the greatest texture of all on the ugliest piece of fabric you've ever dyed. Okay, so this is an early quilt. I call it my Amish period. And I was painting in that upstairs bedroom, and these blocks in the 9 patch, you know, they added up to about a yard of fabric, and I cut it apart and repieced it together. And I was still going down to the garage and immersion dyeing the silk in big buckets because that's all I knew how to do. Here's a piece that's silk screened and immersion dyed the same way. And it was important to me to be able to put my needle through the fabric, but it was also just about the end of those buckets. Here's a picture of that whole quilt. All of these are painted dye with thickener, and then the solids I did in the buckets.